for Boston WCVB's Chronicle for close to 30 years, where he received prestigious awards for his coverage of the Boston's Big Dig Project, the Goodnight Lights phenomenon in Providence, Rhode Island. He's hosted specials for the Discovery Channel, HGTV, and done extensive work for the Travel Channel's photo adventure series Freeze Frame, where he explored Hawaii's volcanoes, the caves of Puerto Rico, and the South Pacific islands of Tahiti. It's a tough job he has. It's where somebody's got to do it. Someone's got to do it. So, although he's written many highly acclaimed books, he's here to share his newly released Travels Through the Heart and Soul of New England. And on another note, I'd love to thank our friends of Paul Pratt Library, one of whom is here tonight, and we work in collaboration with them a lot to bring people like Ted here. So without further ado, welcome, Ted.
Thank you. Thanks, Patty. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Patty. Thank you all for coming out on a night when, you know, some blizzard. That's not going to happen. Makes everybody afraid. You know, it's always that first time that there's a little flurry, and it's like, it really is true. It's like you've never seen it before, right? You're like a little kid. And when you see, oh my God, you know, you're looking out the window. But I think we're all going to make it. I think you'll get safely returned home in just over an hour. But thank you all very much for coming out. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Coming down to the South Shore, it never, like, I've been coming down here, well, I mean, for, you know, most of my life in one thing or another, but certainly stories over the years, you know, for Chronicle and whatnot. So it's not like it's a foreign environment for me. And yet, in a way, if you're a North Shore kid like me, but I always say, I'm sure people from the South Shore feel the same thing when they're trying to work their way through the wilds of, you know, Peabody or, you know, Linfield, Marblehead. But it never fails to, I always feel like if I didn't have GPS at the end of my maps, I would be still trying to work my way out mid-afternoon tomorrow. But it's beautiful. And we share the same thing, which is that I grew up on the water on the North Shore. You're on the water here, and I was on the water in Winthrop, which is actually funny because Winthrop is not really North Shore. It's not really South Shore. What it does is just stick its little butt out into the harbor there, right? But it's not really north or south. Winthrop, as I like to refer to it, as I refer to it as the charming little seaside town at the end of runway 27L, is more what it's actually adjacent to. But anyway, thank you. And I also want to echo, Patty, about thank you both to the Senior Center and the Wilcott Commons and the Paul Pratt Public Library, where I have spoken a few times before over the years. Anybody been to one of my previous talks in Cohasset? We'll have to see if we can inch that number up a little bit. I think I saw a hand raised. But anyway, thank you. So I'm going to talk to you about my most recent book, which is, I describe it as a love song to New England. How many of you are native New Englanders? I know that Patty grew up in New Jersey, right? New Jersey. Nobody's perfect. I'm kidding. But it's a love song to New England in the sense that this is a book that is entirely about the most memorable people that I've met in almost 30 years of reporting all around New England. These are people whose stories have stayed with me in a way that has endeared them to me, not just as people whose stories have stayed with me, but people who, for the most part, almost every single person I look at here, I have stayed in touch with. Some have become actual true friends with over that time. That is not usual I've done hundreds and hundreds of stories over that period of time, and that is certainly not the case with all. That's why this book is just these people, the people whose stories stayed with me, the people who are the most memorable people that I've met in my travels. Now, if you have watched any of my travel pieces for Chronicle over the years, you may know that there's a few places that pop up in almost all of my stories. Some are general stores. Many are diners. Sometimes people say, how come you don't weigh 400 pounds? The trick is not to eat everything that's put in front of you. But the reason why those places come up, and they will come up in almost all of these profiles, is not because, you know, I like shopping for things at a general store. It's not because I like eating in a diner. I love eating in a diner, but it's not about the food. I would say there is nothing that you can order at a diner that you can't order at some other place, usually only yards away. There is nothing you can buy on a single shelf in a single general store in a single town in the world that you can't buy cheaper, let's say, online or anywhere else, right? So it's not about what is in these places in terms of the food or the products. It's about the people that are in these places. Because while you can get something cheaper at anywhere other than a diner or a general store, what these places offer is something that is actually priceless. And that is a sense of community. And that is the theme that weaves through every single one of these people and their lives and their stories and their contributions. It is the thing that draws me to places like general stores and public libraries and diners and community rail trails that have been converted for enjoyment by a community. It's all part of that same thing. These are places that we call third places in American life. The first place being home, family, where you spend most of your life. The second place being work, whether like it or not, we spend also most of our lives. But that third place is where the magic happens. By magic, I mean that is where people interact with people who are their neighbors. And you can't do that when you stop at a fast food restaurant on exit whatnot in the middle of nowhere. You're not going to run into a friendly face, but you do. You are here tonight. This is a third place. Wilcott Commons right here. We're in a third place right now. And that's what all of these people and their stories have in common. So we will be stopping at some of my favorite diners. But you know, the book is called Travels Through the Heart and Soul of New England. The subtitle is Stories of Struggle, Resilience, and Triumph. And so what I'm going to do for just under the next 55 minutes or so is take those three areas and give you a few examples, a few stories that go with something like struggle, right? So sometimes struggle is about holding on and trying to preserve an entire way of life, right? And that can be true of many things, but the one that has been the truest for me in terms of spending a lot of time is the struggle to hold on to the fishing industry, and particularly in Gloucester. Look, fishing is hard hit everywhere. Ask them in Newfoundland, where the cod fishery has actually vanished, gone. But in Gloucester, in some ways, it's the most poignant, the most moving, in terms of it being, to start out with, Gloucester being the most storied seaport, the oldest seaport in America, but it's also the place where the challenges and the struggle of the American fishing industry are on starkest display, because no one has been savaged more by the rules and regulations. And by the way, I want to point out that in terms of the rules and regulations that the federal government began to put in place about 55 years ago to try to arrest the decline, it was specifically targeted at the cod fishery, but of course it's affected all. The decline has affected all fishing species. But the point is, I'm not going to get into the politics, the data, the science of it. A, I'm not qualified. B, I'm not qualified. C, right. So I'm not going to get into that. That data, by the way, is not definitive. We don't know even now. NOAA wouldn't be able to tell you today whether or not that's actually worked or not. They will point to some good signs, some not so good signs. Here's what we know for certain. Families have been devastated by the rules and regs. Whether or not that brings the fishery back, there may not be people to fish if they ever come back. You know, it's been estimated. There's Gloucester Harbor in the 1920s. It was estimated that in 1900, the number of family-owned fishing boats in Gloucester, and by the way, family-owned fishing boats is a term we use now. It wasn't used then because there was nothing but family-owned fishing boats. That's what boats were. They were owned by individuals, families. They were passed down along with the knowledge, most importantly, the knowledge that goes with them, passed down from generation to generation. There was no such thing as a corporate boat. That's the majority of boats in Gloucester today, corporate boats. These are boats that are owned by a consortium, a collection of investors. Sometimes it's multiple boats. But in 1900, it's estimated that there were about 2,500 family-owned fishing boats in Gloucester. It was said, and you can kind of get it from this picture, which is why I chose it, it was said that you could walk around the huge horseshoe that is Gloucester's inner harbor right there. You could walk around the entire harbor, technically on the water, jumping from stern to bow, around the entire horseshoe and never get your feet wet. That was 1900. In 1970, it was estimated that the number of family-owned fishing boats were down to 1,200. Those are both estimates. Last year, 2023, we know the exact number, 79. So they are disappearing. They are disappearing. And to somebody like Paul, see, yeah, there you go. There you have it then, and there you have it today, where not only are not boats tied up at the dock itself is falling into the water. And for people like Joe Sanfilippo, Joe's been a friend of mine for 15, 16 years now. And Joe is now 5, not 4. When I put this together, it was 4. Now it's 5 generations of fishing in Gloucester. Joe had to abandon fishing about 10 years ago. It just became too punishing economically. Look, you got kids, you got a mortgage. You can't deal with what they call rolling closures. These are closures of major fishing banks like George's or Stellwagen, that may close overnight. You're a fishing guy. You got your boat outfitted to fish the banks the next day. That means you are baited up. That's thousands of dollars for bait. You've got everything that goes with that, food, ice. You've got a crew of 3. Everybody gets paid whether you go out or not. And if they put a rolling closure into place overnight, you get that ping at 2 o'clock in the morning. You're not going out, but you've paid for everything, including the crew. So it's too punishing for a lot of people. It was for Joe. He talked to me that day. He had tears in his eyes when I asked him, do you miss fishing? And right at that moment, he was saying, every single day. There's no reason I should. It kills you, but I miss it every single day. He actually still gets to be on the water, work on the water, right over his right shoulder there, the Beauport. He captains the Beauport, which is a cruise vessel out of Gloucester Harbor. But Joe has done something about the loss of family fishing, because as he puts it, it's not the boats that's irreplaceable. You can replace a boat. It's the knowledge. It's as he puts it, the pipeline of generational fishing knowledge. When that goes away, that's irreplaceable. You don't go to the local community college and take Fishing 101 if you want to know how to fish. You don't get a book out of the library, even a great library like the Paul Pratt, and pick up, Fishing for Dummies. It doesn't, right? That is handed down the generation. Joe learned to fish when he was 12 years old from his older brother, Ricky. His older brother learned to fish from their dad. The dad learned to fish from their grandfather. The grandfather learned to fish from their great-grandfather. That's how it's been. When that pipeline goes dry, the knowledge is gone. So it really is a thought to contemplate. It's like that old, what if they gave a party and nobody came? What if they relaxed the rules and regs and said the banks are open, there's no more restrictions, and there's no one left to fish? So what Joe has done, however quixotic it sounds, and it is really, he has started what I describe as night school for fishing, right? He understands that people are not going to learn to fish anymore by dint of their family, the generations in their family. So he is teaching people how to fish at night. He works all day, and then he's got this rented warehouse space, and he teaches the fundamentals of fishing. To whom? Old, young, men, women. These are people who don't have commercial fishing licenses. They don't have a commercial fishing vessel. They may not be able or be in a position to fish commercially. They won't be next year. They won't be in 5 years, maybe not even in 10 years. Who knows? Maybe none of them will ever fish commercially. But this is what I love about what Joe has done, because in that sense of a struggle and your response to a struggle, so there's two ways you can respond to a struggle. You can fold and give up. And look, sometimes that's how it goes. And there's no shame in that. Sometimes we are no longer in a position to struggle, and that's the way it is. But what Joe has said is, I am in a position to try to do something about this, and I'm doing it. And I love that. I love that response, to struggle. And there he is, kind of thing he would have been doing, and kids did for years and years, not anymore, on the docks of Gloucester on a sunny weekend day. They'd be sitting mending their grandparents' nets, and now Joe is teaching that to people who've never handled a fishing net at all. I love that. Sometimes struggle, as we all know only too well, often when we get up in the morning, can be physical, right? One of my favorite stories about somebody struggling, and in a physical struggle, is my friend Louis Escobar, the late Louis Escobar. We lost Louis about two years ago, but Louis was a rarity of rarities, right? He was a farmer in Rhode Island. You may know there is not a lot of room to farm in Rhode Island. Most of the farming today in Rhode Island, actually, they grow grass. I don't mean cannabis. I mean, they grow grass for lawns, right? Turf farming. That's the main farming. Because you don't need a lot of room to grow grass. A guy once told me, if I have 3.5 acres, I can stay in business. Because, they grow the grass and then they cut it. They roll it up. You ever seen that? They roll it up like a carpet. And then they come to your house and they unroll it like a carpet. And instead of vacuuming it, you water it, right? But rarity of rarities, so farmer in Rhode Island and a dairy farmer. You do need a lot of land to dairy farm, right? You have to graze a herd of cows. If you're a dairy farmer, which he did, he had a really nice spread in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. So think the north part of Aquidneck Island, right? That big blob that sits in Narragansett. And he started a wonderful milk cooperative with the other 2 dairy farmers in Rhode Island. And things were going well until about 21 years ago when he had a terrible accident on the farm. His tractor fell on him. And if you are lucky to survive that kind of thing happening, you're not going to be left unscathed. And he wasn't. Unfortunately, he was left a quadriplegic. And yet, you talk about facing a struggle. So this was a guy who everybody simply expected at that point. You'll sell the farm, or you'll never, ever once thought of giving up the farm. And it was 3 generations, didn't think of giving it up. Got himself outfitted with a very powerful electric wheelchair, a very fast electric wheelchair, which I can say because it's very humbling to find yourself trotting to keep up with a guy in a wheelchair. But nonetheless, he said that he felt more productive after the accident than he felt before the accident. I said, Louis, all respect, how can that be? And he said, very simple. I never made a single plan in my life. Hate plans, had nothing written down. I get up in the morning, I get up every day at 4 o'clock. If I feel like doing something out of order at 5 o'clock in the morning, I'll do it. If the cow's got to wait to eat, they'll wait. Couldn't do that anymore. He had to make very detailed, specific plans because he had 3 or 4 people who were doing those things for him during the day, even while he would tool around and keep his eye on them. And to me, again, a very inspiring approach to a struggle. Sometimes the struggle, as any good journalist will tell you, is about simply trying to get a good story out to people who may really, really want to read and find out about this story, but they won't know unless somebody finds a way to get the story out. And that's what Jerry Ann Boggess has been doing really all of her life. She's really one of the most impressive women I've ever met in terms of, you talk about responding to a struggle and driving forward and there being no rearview mirror and no failure and no second thoughts. She's really an impressive woman. She lived the American immigrant experience. She emigrated from Jamaica in the early 1970s, raised a couple of 2 wonderful kids who went on to college in New Hampshire. And Jerry Ann, although she's not a journalist, she would be a wonderful journalist because she has a lot of great qualities. She's smart, she's a good writer, she loves to ask people questions, she loves to dig down and find stuff out of wherever she is. And she found herself in the little town of Milford, New Hampshire. Now, Milford, New Hampshire is a small town. It's a bedroom community for not so much Boston, but more Manchester and Concord and Nashua. It is about 12 miles due west of Nashua. Lovely little town. Not a lot of people who looked like Jerry Ann when she moved there. And not so many more today, but even less then. And, you know, that's okay. But you know what she did? She found herself very curious, because she's a very, very curious person. And she found herself curious and wanted to set herself to seeing, could she find if there had ever been somebody who looked like her in Milford, New Hampshire. And she found that person. She found more people than just that person. In fact, Jerry Ann went on to become the co-founder of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. Today, she is the executive director. And it's a fascinating thing. It really is. I mean, you think of something like the Freedom Trail, but this trail is not so much about the early days of American independence as it is about Black history in New Hampshire, where very often we wouldn't even expect to have a lot of Black history in New Hampshire. But there is. Case in point, I was blown away. I had no idea. That spot right there where she's standing, right in Portsmouth Harbor, slave auctions in the mid-19th century. So that's the kind of work she does today, but when she first started, she made a very significant find. I mean, the kind of find that had historians and researchers trooping to Milford, New Hampshire, right? And, you know, it's not as if no one knew this person existed, because if you're finding like a 2,000-year-old shard of a pot in the desert, then no one knew that was there. I mean, except the person whose pot it was. But when it's a person, there's generally some kind of paper trail, right? But this was someone who had slipped entirely under the radar. Entirely. Even though she's buried minutes from here in Quincy. But this was someone who slipped entirely under the radar. And this is someone who has a significant profile in American history, especially African American history. She is, I don't know if you've ever heard of two women, actually. Ona Judge. Ona Judge is famous today because she was the personal maidservant of Martha Washington, right? And she lived in Mount Vernon with George and Martha Washington in their house, not the quarters where the other slaves were, even though she was a slave. She lived in their house. And in Philadelphia in 1796, so this would have been right after Washington had stepped down as president, she was impressed there by the number of what we call freedmen, but that refers to men and women, who were slaves who were living freely in Philadelphia. And she decided, I want to join them. And she did. And she went AWOL. The Washingtons kept up a search for her for almost a decade, coming back and forth up to New England. It was thought that she had somehow disappeared into New Hampshire somewhere, and she had. Probably only minutes from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, perhaps in the Newcastle area, all in that greater Dover, Portsmouth area. She was never caught, but never freed, really legally either. She lived in the shadows her entire life. But the even more remarkable story is Harriet E. Wilson. This was the story, this was the person that Jerry Ann Boggess found, in a sense, when she was doing that research. Harriet E. Wilson, unlike Jerry Ann, was an actual native of New Hampshire. She was an American citizen. She was born to a young Black couple who already had a couple of kids. And in the early 1800s, they simply could not afford another mouth. She was swaddled up into blankets, put in a basket, wicker basket, and she was left on the front porch of a wealthy white family in Milford, New Hampshire. She was taken in by the family, and she became their indentured servant. She was a very bright young woman. She loved to read. She loved to write. She kept a series of journals. And in 1859, Harriet E. Wilson became the first Black novelist to be published in North America. This was really not known. I mean, people who would have interacted with Harriet E. Wilson might have known that. But this was not a historical fact until Jerry Ann was able to make it more of a historical fact. And Jerry Ann, in her way to fight through to the finish, in 2006, Jerry Ann was able to persuade the town of Milford, New Hampshire, to create a permanent memorial to Harriet E. Wilson. So our first pit stop. Anybody ever been to the Windsor Diner? Anybody? You have. Windsor Diner is a great diner, very authentic diner. It's a genuine Worcester dining car diner. I forget its medallion number, but it's a great diner. It's right by the long Windsor Cornish covered bridge, which is the longest covered bridge in New England. And Teresa Rhodes, we talked about a rarity of rarity in terms of a farmer. Teresa Rhodes is a rarity of rarity in terms of a diner owner, because first of all, she's one of the few women who own outright their own diner. You may think there would be more. There are not. Certainly not as many as men, but she is one of them. But what's more remarkable is that Teresa Rhodes is the only, and I've been in a few diners over the years, only diner I have ever seen or heard of that is run solo by somebody. In this case, this remarkable woman. When I say solo, there's no one else working there. Now, sometimes on a very crazy busy fall foliage weekend, she might have a couple of high school kids helping her behind the line. But like on this morning that I visited, just her. I was like, I kept telling her, I said, wait, but you know, she said, it's just me, Ted, trust me. No one's walking through the door. And I'm watching her work, and she's doing it. She's like cooking by herself. She's getting stuff. She's running behind the freezer. She's coming back. She's taking orders. And you know, everybody that's in a diner at any given moment, right, is at a different stage of their diner visit. Some people have already eaten. They're waiting to cash out, right? Some people are waiting to order. Some people have already ordered. Everybody's in it. She's got to contend with all of that. And she did. I'm watching her, and I was sitting on a stool over there, and most of the people were on this end, and I'm watching. I'm trying to figure out, what is the trick? What is the trick? I wouldn't be able to last 30 seconds. And I said, I called over to her, and I said, Teresa, don't even look at me. Just keep working, keep working, keep working. I said, just if you can process this question while you're working. I'm sitting here, and I'm trying to figure out, what the hell is your secret? What is your secret? She said, very simple. You mean how I do that? Yeah. She said, I don't move. I can't move. I said, no, I can't move. This is my spot. Everybody in here right now knows it. I can't move. I have to make sure that I've got the grill, everything going. Everything else I can do from here. And I said, she said, just watch. She finished plating. I've never seen this. I've seen it maybe in a movie. I've never seen this, right? So she finished this plate. This guy was sitting over at this end of the counter. Fortunately, I think everybody in there was local, so they understood the verbal prompts. And she said, she turned around with that plate. She said, arms up. Everyone sat back like this, like a Frisbee, like a Frisbee. Down along the thing, and the guy caught it. He knew how to catch it. You don't try to do this. You just let it fall into your palms. I said, that's how you do it, okay? So the other thing that was remarkable about the day that I loved the day I was there was I got to meet this guy, Billy Nye. When I say Billy Nye is a long-time customer. Billy Nye used to be in that diner when he was a little boy, and he is 87, 83 when I met him a couple years ago. Little boy, his mom was a waitress at the diner. Every day, he said, he'd come into the diner after school. He'd put his little Billy book bag right here. He'd sit in that stool right there. He'd start his homework. His mom would bring him a pencil and a glass of milk and a slice of pie. So he's telling me this, and I said, and then so he had just moved back to be closer to his daughter and his family. And he was doing some house painting, and he's telling me about that. I said, wait, Billy, time out. Something is bothering me. He said, what's that? I said, well, that's your stool, right? This was the stool yes, that was my stool. I said, okay, so that's your stool forever. If the diner goes away, they're going to have to bronze the stool and put it out on the sidewalk with a plaque with your name. How come you're not sitting on your stool? And he said, well, that's a good question. He said, you know, when I came back here, it had been over 50 years since I've been in the diner. And I was delighted. It was still here. It was still open. I walked in. It was like, oh, my stool is still there. And I walked in. And I was going to sit there. And then I thought to myself, Billy, maybe it's time you graduated to the next stool. And he did. And who can blame him, right? So resilience. I don't know what you think. I always think, we were joking about the weather, right? We were joking about the weather when we started. I always think that resilience is part of New England's DNA. Seriously. If for no other reason than weather, you have to be weather resilient. Think of how much, different kinds of wardrobe you need, right? Because sometimes it's windy, it's cool, but it's not going to rain. But sometimes it's going to rain, but it's actually going to be warm. People in other parts of the country are like, how do you do that? You do not have to be weather resilient in San Diego, ever, right? But one of the things I always think of, and this is what I share in the book, when I think of resilience in New England, believe it or not, the thing that stays with me most is not a person, although people are going to be part of this, you'll see. It's actually something that's inanimate. New England's mill towns, the mill towns, those mill buildings that have never gone away. You want to talk about resilient? There were decades and decades when all those mill towns, whether it's Woonsocket, Pawtucket, Haverhill, Lowell, Lawrence, what have you, there were decades where those poor cities and towns would have given anything to blow up those damn mill buildings and get rid of them, because after the mill companies had left, as you know, those buildings everywhere in all of those mill towns were nothing but targets for crime and drugs and arson. And it costs towns a lot of money. You may think, well, obviously they're not bringing any tax revenue. They also cost towns and cities. I heard a figure once that was unbelievable to me. The mayor of Haverhill, in the millions, over 40, 50 years, in police details. You have to detail police, even though no one's in there. Well, there are people in there. That's the problem. And that's why you have to detail police overnight, making multiple stops. That costs money, right? And they were all abandoned. But those mill buildings, whether it's Biddeford or anywhere else in New England, you know what the story is with these mill buildings. They weren't made to be torn down. They are the face of brick and mortar resilience. They were not made to be torn down. A lot of these cities and towns would have loved to tear them down. A lot of these cities and towns would very often price what it would cost to get rid of them, demolish them, and almost invariably it was more expensive than to just let them be. So they sat. And by the 90s, of course, the national economy changed in a way that really began to allow some things to come back to these mills, almost universally not textiles, but now all kinds of mixed use, commercial, residential, condos, all kinds of businesses that needed large square footage in urban settings, like big pharma, biotech, right? And these were able now to inhabit the mills for the first time in decades and decades. It was that public-private partnership thing. I talked about Haverhill. Haverhill was once the shoe center of America. It also had a thriving textile industry. And then it went through that same period. All of these mill towns shared the same experience, really the same experience. They knew what it was like to have great prosperity, and then they knew what it was like for that to go away and to be sunk. The companies can leave, and they did, seeking cheaper labor in the South and later overseas. The cities and towns can't leave, right? So they're left. And when the economy turned and these places were actually able to attract people to come in and inhabit the mills again, that was an amazing thing for places like Biddeford. Because Biddeford was incredibly devastated. When the mills had finally closed down, Biddeford knew what it was like to not simply be abandoned, but to be humiliated. To be humiliated. Here's something we don't often think about. You think about the textile industry leaving a place like Biddeford, Lewiston, North Adams, Lowell, Lawrence, same story. And you think about, well, geez, that's really crushing economically because, you've lost the tax base, you've lost all these jobs. That's true. But it's also devastating psychologically, emotionally. You take Biddeford. So just like we have vulnerable human populations, whether they're homeless folks or what have you, right? That are preyed upon, Cities, vulnerable cities who are in dire economic straits are preyed upon. There are companies that prey. By prey upon, I mean something that would get cited in a place like Biddeford, right? That would never happen in Cohasset or Wellesley or what have you. Never happen. You would never get a solid waste incinerator sited in the center of this town, right? And that's good. But it's not good for anybody to have one site. And that's what happened to Biddeford. So a guy like Alan Cassavant, fourth generation French Canadian kid, grew up in Biddeford, went on to become a math teacher, went on to become the longest serving mayor in Biddeford's history. But he remembers what it's like in both the dark, bad days and when it began to come back. He remembers as a 10, 11-year-old kid in the late 60s, he remembers walking downtown on a Saturday night with his parents and everything was open till 10 o'clock at night, the bars, the restaurants, everybody was flush with cash from being paid the day before. And he also remembers what it was like 25 years later. And by the late 80s, mid 80s, when walking down the main street in Biddeford on a Saturday night meant that there was basically nothing open. And burning brightly above the city, downtown, was a solid waste incinerator. And he remembers, he's the one who used that word, not me. He said, you know, I'd get up to go to high school, and you step outside in the morning, and you forget it's there, and then you smell, and you know what they're incinerating that morning. And it was humiliating, he said. It was humiliating because I knew that my city had no choice but to accept this humiliation because that's the state we were in. And he is fortunate enough to be, in fact, more than fortunate. It was his, he would say it was his lifelong joy that he got to push that plunger in to bring the incinerator down. In 1990, when he had become mayor, he is beloved. He's one of these people. Look, he's not a business guy. He's not a business guy. He's a great math teacher. But he's that kind of guy who has that irrepressible sense of optimism. That's what you got to have to be resilient, right? Whether it's fighting a disease or fighting for better days economically in your city. And he's the kind of guy who just said, we will find a way. And he was able, because that's the kind of guy he is, to attract great business people, to attract investors and so forth. And they were able to completely restore the entire mill center of Biddeford, great little restaurants and cafes and private companies, a couple of great breweries. And you know, he has said that I'm not a politician. I'm really not a politician. I'm a math teacher, and I'm in way over my head, but somehow we've been able to make a go of it. That's baloney, okay? He's actually a great politician and very smart. And just look at, you know, some of the things that they've restored now in Biddeford, like the City Theater. The City Theater in Biddeford is one of these places, you've seen them. There are places, most old New England towns have a place like this. Sometimes it's almost always sort of a Victorian era kind of thing. It's usually wood, sometimes it's stone or brick, but these municipal buildings, very often they do multiple uses, right? There might be the town hall, they might have the library in them, but they always had some sort of, we're talking about a third place, they had some sort of community space for dances, for lectures. Charles Dickens spoke at the City Theater in Biddeford, Maine, in the 1850s. You know, my friend Tim Sample, who's a wonderful humorist out of Maine, he had a rock band in the when he was in his 20s. He was one of the last acts to play the City Theater. And this, mind you, is a year before it was actually condemned. So he was amazed when I brought him back there because this wonderful, you talk about these wonderful public-private partnerships. Well, the Friends of the City Theater, right, were able to find a way to completely restore it. He couldn't get over it. In fact, right there, he was pointing to the other side of the wall because he said, you know, the wallpaper was rolling down literally. You could see it sometimes as you're standing there. And he said, you know, when we would take our breaks, he said, you know, since I'm the tallest one, he said everybody would egg me on to jump up and see if I could grab a roll of it, and we'd see if we could get the entire panel to come down. What fun. And so then it was condemned a year later, and then a year after that, the humiliation just continued for Biddeford because the city blew out the back wall of the theater. They put in a couple of big commercial garage doors, and the DPW is storing road salt where Charles Dickens once lectured. So not anymore. But the funny thing about, I think about Alan Cassavant saying I'm not a politician, the Palace Diner. The Palace Diner is my favorite type of diner, which is a diner that has reopened after being closed. And it was once the gem of Biddeford. Everybody came to the Palace Diner, and then it was closed for a long time. And Chad Conley and Greg Mitchell, a couple of foodies out of Portland, Maine. Now, if you know Portland, Maine today, you may know that it's a real food mecca today. It really is. And these guys were young chefs, and they had decided that they wanted to open up their own restaurant. Well, good luck. Because if you don't, I'm told that if you don't have high six figures in Portland today, you're not even getting into the game of discussions with the city and investors. That's what it takes to get into the game, not to open into the game. They didn't have that kind of money. So somebody told them about the Palace Diner down in Biddeford. And they were like, look, we like diners as much as the next guy, but I mean, we're not diner chefs. I mean, what are we gonna do with a diner? But they were prevailed upon to come and visit the Palace Diner. So Alan Cassavant, who says he's not a good politician, in his position as mayor, he was able to requisition a couple of school buses, and he knew they were coming down there, and he got a whole bunch of volunteers, and they made these big signs. They didn't say anything. So Alan and Greg and Chad are in the diner, right? It would have been daytime, and these windows look out into a parking area. And so the school buses roll in, and the volunteers get out, and they've all got these signs that all say the exact same thing. Please buy me. And they just stood there, and they're looking at this, and they bought it. So no politician, baloney. So sometimes you find resilience in a place you don't expect to find it, like a little ski hill. Now, this is a very unique ski hill. Anybody here ski or have skied? Or, yeah? I started skiing when I was a very young kid. My parents didn't ski, but I had a wonderful uncle whose son was my age, and he lived up in New Hampshire, and big skier, and had me come up every weekend in the winter. So that's how I learned to ski. I love to ski. I feel very lucky that I'm still able to ski. I feel very lucky that I've been able to introduce skiing to my daughters, both of whom love to ski. And when I say that I feel very lucky that I'm still able to ski, I don't mean physically, although it doesn't get easier, but I don't mean physically, I mean financially. Because if you know anything about the ski industry today, you know how incredibly expensive skiing has become. There is a ski area in Colorado this year that will break the more than $300 a day for a lift ticket. I remember that uncle at Mount Sunapee, New Hampshire in 1969, 70. I think it must have been our first time there for the season. And so they had jacked up the prices. And Sunapee was a little state-owned ski area. And I'll never forget because I was standing right behind him at the window, right? And he was a big guy. And the guy had told him what the prices were now, and he like stepped back like this, and I went flying, and I'm looking up from the floor, and I hear him yelling at the guy, and he says, "Are you kidding me? $12.50 for the day?" $12.50 today will not buy you a soft drink, I don't think, at Mount Sunapee, right? So the point is, I love skiing. I hate the ski industry. I'm not going to get into it now. Google it sometime. The fact is, that's not my subjective feeling. That's an objective fact in the sense that the ski industry some years ago, I mean decades, made a choice. They made a choice to grow the sport. Look, whatever your business is, you can grow it in one of two ways, basically, right? You can price competitively, and you can grow by volume, right? You can make it attractive for anybody to buy your product. That's not what they did. That's not what they did. And they decided to target a very specific affluent demographic and grow it that way. That's what they've done, which is good for them, but it's bad for the vast majority of Americans who simply, factually cannot afford to ski, okay? That's not what this is. This is the antidote to everything I just said and more. So you may think of Vermont and think of, among many other things, a wonderful place, right? But you may think of there being pockets of real affluence in Vermont. And in places like Stowe and Norwich and Stratton and so forth, there is huge affluence, even more so post-COVID, when a lot of people moved from the metropolitan New York, New Jersey area up into Vermont. So that is true. That is true. What's less well known is that there are pockets of real crushing poverty in Vermont. I don't mean low income. I mean poverty line level poverty. This, ironically, is one of those places. So why would there be a ski hill here? There's been a ski hill in Little East Corinth, Vermont, since the 1930s, 1935. East Corinth today is one of the poorer areas of Vermont. It sits in that little southwest corner of Orange County, Vermont. Orange County, Vermont has exactly zero in common with the far more famous orange counties in America. And so why is there a ski hill? Well, there was a ski hill in the 1930s, and then it closed. It closed in the mid-'70s, and then it was closed for more than a decade. And then some people came together, and they wanted to reopen the ski hill. We're talking about community. These are people in the community who knew their community. These were people, many of those who were interested in reopening the hill were not people who were themselves living at the poverty line, but they understood that comprised many of their neighbors. So what do you do about reopening a ski hill when skiing has become so expensive? Well, obviously, they weren't going to price it very expensively. They certainly weren't. However, the point was made, there are some people who still won't be able to afford that, and they certainly won't be able to afford the thousands of dollars you're going to have to lay out for a family of kids and ski equipment. And so what they decided was they would make it a nonprofit. And today, Little Northeast Slopes is one of three nonprofit ski areas in America, which I always like to think is the supreme oxymoron. Forget jumbo shrimp. Nonprofit ski area is the ultimate oxymoron. But that's what it is. They've got a board. Everything is volunteer. Everything is contributed. And the wonderful thing is that people from all over Vermont contribute equipment. They have the wonderful ski library, which is an old school bus that is filled with donated ski equipment from ski shops all over Vermont. And kids roll in after school to ski. If you can't afford a lift ticket, you don't pay. That's all. There's no stigma. If you can afford something, you're asked to contribute. If you don't have equipment, you get equipment from the ski bus. If you want to hold on to it for the season, hold on to it. No one's going to hunt you down. You want to keep it because you don't own skis? Keep them. Try that at Killington. So it was my good fortune when I visited to meet. So there you go. There's Little Northeast Slopes in the 1930s. Wade Pearson, one of the most winning people I've ever met, because everything to Wade is about fixing it. It doesn't matter whether it's an engine. He owns a very small trucking business. He grew up in East Corinth. He is not poor. He wasn't wealthy, but he understands that many of his neighbors are at very different places economically. And his feeling was, when they were talking about, he was part of that group that was trying to reopen it, and he finally, people going back and forth, should we do this, should we do that? He said, I don't care what we do, but we are going to decide that every kid in this town who wants to ski is going to ski because we're in Vermont. God damn it, is what he actually said. And you ski. And that carried the day. And it doesn't matter, the kids rolling out of the ski bus. And, it was my great good fortune when I visited about 4 or 5 years ago. Wade was on the mountain that day, and he was running the rope tow. The rope tow today, running the rope, as they say, that rope tow is the original rope tow. The rope tow today at Northeast Slopes is the oldest continuously operating ski lift of any kind in North America. So I'm watching this rope tow. Now, some folks said they skied. I don't know, you must have at some point in your life used the rope tow. Very, very uncommon today, except at Northeast Slopes. So I brought my skis because I wanted to take a run down the hill before we left. And I'm looking at this rope, and this rope was flying in a way I've never seen a rope move. I mean, it was like, whoa. It had made a groove because of its friction in the snow about 2 feet deep. So I said, first I'm going to have to fish the rope out, which is going to be embarrassing to begin with. But then I was trying to think, what's the trick? There's a trick of how you actually get going on a rope tow. Because if you just pick up the rope and grab it, you're going to go about 10 feet in the air. And I knew, this is only about 4 or 5 years ago, so I knew at that point in my life, it was dicey if I would survive going 10 feet in the air. So I said to Wade, I said, what the hell do you have running this rope tow? What do you have, a jet engine back there? He said, let me show you. He said, it's not exactly a jet engine. Oh, does he slave over that Dodge Dart with the slant six? Say the car doesn't look like much, but I'll tell you what, you could eat off the manifold. He works on that thing. That's what's running the lift. It was such an amazing day. So you might wonder, how much money did I spend of a day of skiing at Little Northeast Slopes? I did not break $20. I spent $10.50 for, which is all they let me pay, but I did donate my skis afterward. I spent $10.50 for a lift ticket. I spent another $6 for a delicious Nor'easter burger, which was absolutely delicious. And I don't think that $16.50 will buy you a soft drink at Vail. I'm not kidding. Maybe not even a water. Maybe not even a water. And that day restored my faith, never mind in skiing, which it did, but it restored my faith once again in that magic word, community. So when it comes to resilience, I also think that very often humor is a big part of resilience, don't you think? Right? Being able to laugh, whether it's at yourself or even better at someone else. Whether it's able to laugh or manage, a smile. Look, some days you can't. Some days in some situations you can't, and that's just the way it is. But to Becky Rule, she's the person who's going to try to get you to laugh. And she does it in a myriad of ways, sometimes like that. I said, Becky, give me your resting face. Ah, that's it. So that's her resting face. So you feel like you've missed something the second you meet her, right? She's the person you would meet and immediately think, what's so funny? What did I miss? I said, nothing. What? She just cracks me up. Becky is a wonderful writer, humorist. She does a lot of speaking. She's much funnier than I am. And her really, her whole area that she's made a world for herself in is New Englandisms, right? So talking to people about what makes things quintessentially New England, And we have had long discussions, for instance, about, well, I asked her once, when do you become a native in a small New England town, right? Because that's a thing, as you well know. That's a thing. That is a thing. And I asked her because I had recently, when I posed that question to her, I had recently been up in Waldoboro, Maine. Anybody ever been to Moody's Diner? Moody's is a great diner on Route 1 in Waldoboro, Maine. But I was in there years ago. And I wanted to talk to somebody, in terms of what I was writing, I wanted to talk to someone who would have gone familiar with the diner years and years ago, maybe even as a little kid. And I see this guy sitting at the counter, and he looked like the real deal. He's a considerably older gentleman, and he had a seed store hat on, he had his coveralls. And I always look at, if I want to know if somebody's local, I always look at their feet, because I could tell by his boots he had some fresh muck on the bottom of his boots. So I knew that he'd been working locally this morning. So I sat down, I introduced myself. I knew it was weird, but I said, I told him what I was doing. And I said, so let me understand correctly, Jeff, you're a local, right? You're a native. He's a native? No, sir. You're not a native? No, sir. I said, how long have you lived here? Next March, it'll be 92 and a half years. And you're not a native? No, sir. So it turns out his parents had moved from New Jersey. His parents had moved from New Jersey when he was like 6 months old. But he won't call himself a native. So I said to Becky, Becky, that's just not right. That's like you're a native by acclaim at that point. She said, there's actually a very simple rule to when you become a native in a New England town. She said, when the last person in that town who remembers when you moved there dies, knock yourself out, you're a native, right? So I love her last book. You speaking of New Englandism, her last book was called Heading for the Rhubarb. And I love it because I've never seen anything like it. It is a glossary of old New England expressions that are no longer used. Well, one of them is used. I'm going to give you that in a minute. But they're no longer used, right? So, like heading for the rhubarb. So apparently, I'm not a horse person, so I didn't know this, but apparently rhubarb is really, really bad for horses. So in the old days, if you saw your horse heading down for the rhubarb, you want to go down and get that horse back as fast as possible, right? But over time, it started to become used to describe anybody who's heading for trouble, right? In any way. So I love the example in the book she used. She said, you might have a couple of guys, a couple of friends, sitting on the front porch of the diner, and they're sitting there in the morning enjoying their coffee, and they see another friend of theirs start walking up the street. And he's walking up the street arm in arm with his new lady friend. And one of the guys says to the other guy, I'll tell you right now, he is heading for the rhubarb with that one. So I'm going to give you want to try your hand at a New Englandism? This one is still used, okay? So the word is Adelphia. Now, I'm looking at this word on the page in front of Becky, and it was embarrassing, because I said, give me a hint. She said, no, you can get it. I said, I can't get it. I don't. Is it a place? No, it's not a place. I said, well, use it in a sentence. And she said, well, I might go next door to Barrington over to Caleb's General Store, and I might pick up a few things, and I bring my little basket up to the front counter, and Tina at the counter might say to me, okay, hon, Adelphia? Yeah, you got it. I didn't. So here's resilience in a diner form. Resilience in a diner, right? So the Brunswick Diner in Brunswick, Maine is a wonderful diner, also owned and run for many, many years by a woman, wonderful Jane Davis. And Jane's daughter Cassidy essentially grew up in the diner. Jane was a single mom, and Cassidy had to come with her mom every single morning when she opened up the diner. Imagine, right? Your mom has to open up the diner at 5:30 in the morning. Well, you got to get up at 5:30 and traipse over to the diner, and she'd sit at the counter in the dark and start, finish her homework and have her breakfast, and the school bus would stop at the diner and pick her up. So about just after COVID, 22, 23, Jane decided, I can't do this anymore. She had survived COVID, the diner had survived, but she couldn't do it anymore. She called Cassidy. Cassidy was working on a nice job in Portland at that point, and she said, Cass, can you come out and help me wind down the diner? I got to hang it up, but I could use your help. She did. She took a week off. She came out to Brunswick, started helping her mom, and that week she was there, it's great to hear her describe it, because she said, I just sat back sometimes and watched people coming in, and they would burst into tears with my mom about it closing. And then they'd see me, and they'd say, oh my God, that's Cassidy, you were like this. Midway through the week, she decided she wasn't going back to Portland. She could not see closing up the diner. So today, Cassidy is the owner of the brand. That's resilience. So lastly, we'll finish on a nice up note. Triumph, which is better than struggle and resilience, always. Although often you got to go through struggle and resilience to get there. And for a guy like Larson Ojala, you got to go through a lot worse. You can fail at anything in life. You can struggle and fail at anything in life. Business, marriage, what have you. But if you fail at drug abuse, usually it's fatal. And nobody knows that better than Larson Ojala. Larson grew up in Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire. So Fitzwilliam, next door to Jaffrey, the two towns that are straddled by Mount Monadnock. As a kid, he used to run up and down Mount Monadnock. That's what he did, not hiking. By the time he was 20, he couldn't run up a flight of stairs. In fact, he was very lucky he wasn't dead, because he can count plenty of friends he did grow up with when he was a kid who are dead. So he started abusing at 9 or 10. By the time he was 13, he had graduated to truly serious stuff like fentanyl and heroin. And again, he knows only too well how lucky he is. Now, the first step was it had to come from him, and it did. He decided, I am sick of myself. I am sick of my life. I want my life back. So that's the first step. He was also very lucky in that he had a loving family who wanted to support him, who had already been through hell and back with him, and they supported him. And he had a wonderful mentor who was himself one of these extreme hikers. And actually, that plays part of the story because Larson decided that's what I'm going to make the model for my recovery. One day, I'm going to run up and down Mount Monadnock again. Of course, the staff at the recovery center was like, why don't we see if you can get out of bed each day, okay? And walk to breakfast, and then you'll run up the mountain. How about that? So he did, and today Larson has his own little business in Fitzwilliam. He's got a wonderful wife. He's got 2 great little kids. They hike all over the country. He has endorsement deals now for the kind of hiking that he does. He talks to school kids all over New Hampshire about the dangers of drugs. And true to form, he kept to his goal. And in 2021, Larson Ojala set a new world record for the number of summits. So he, as a kid, he used to run up and down. That was it. In 2021, as an adult, he summited Mount Monadnock. And by summiting, I mean running, not walking. It takes the average hiker, most people take between 3¼ and 3½ hours to hike up Mount Monadnock, hang out a little bit, hike back down. He did 17 summits running in a 24-hour period. And then a year later, he broke his own record, 18 summits in 24 hours. And you know, I knew he was doing that over a Saturday night into Sunday morning. So on Sunday morning, I texted him and I said, Larson, congratulations, man. You are running free. And a little while later, he texted me back and he said, thanks, Ted. Next time, you do it with me. And I like to think I set my own world's record for the number of laughing emojis in one email. But very lastly, we'll end with my favorite story. Good night lights. Anybody familiar with the good night lights phenomenon? You are. Yeah, you are. Yeah. So the good night lights phenomenon in Providence will be happening in 25 minutes. The good night lights phenomenon in Providence, Rhode Island, the only way to describe it is they found a way, and by they, I mean this man, found a way to get the entire city to say goodnight at the same time every night to its most vulnerable population, the children who are fighting cancer and leukemia at Hasbro Children's Hospital. Now, how did that happen? First of all, Steve Brosnahan is an extraordinary person. I love this man. I always say, if you are lucky in life, you meet 1 or 2 people who strike you, and I use this term very advisedly. I don't use it in any religious sense at all, but I think you'll know what I mean. You meet somebody, because there's no other word to describe it, right? You meet someone who you feel like is almost saint-like. We talk about someone with saint-like patience, right? The patience of a saint. He is a remarkably quiet, gentle, compassionate, warm person. He works at Hasbro Children's with the medical team. He likes to joke that he's the lowest paid member of the medical staff at Hasbro Children's. I always remind him the reason for that, as we well know, Steve, is you have no medical degree. But he doesn't. But he also likes to say, however, I'm the only member of the medical staff that when I appear at a patient's door, they're actually happy to see me. Because he's a cartoonist. And when he arrives at a kid's door with his buckets of crayons and markers and paints, holding his big sketch pads, these kids know that for the next hour, they will not be pricked or prodded. There will be no tests or procedures scheduled, and nobody will be walking in a white coat, whispering something to their parents that makes them cry. So for the next hour, they will be transported. And that's what he does. To watch him completely transport. The amazing thing is to watch him walk in. Listen, all these kids, especially the younger ones, these are kids who are in a position in life that they have no idea what's going on. They didn't choose this. They know that this is making their parents very, very alarmed and worried and sad and crying. They don't know what to expect. And he takes their mind off that. And to see him walk into one of these kids' rooms, especially somewhat older kids, who are now at a certain remove, you know, and make them, over the course of an hour, just kind of sit with him. I've seen him put all the crayons and stuff aside and see him buried in serious discussion with, you know, a 15-year-old kid. And the kid is talking to him. He's an amazing person. And he had become friendly years ago with a young kid who was about to be released from the hospital, a young boy. And he wanted to somehow find a way to say a special goodbye to this kid. And so he's visiting with the kid, and he's looking out the kid's window, and he realized that the window faced the entrance to the hospital. And that was interesting to Steve because Steve rides his bike to and from work every day. So he knew that he'd be wheeling his bike right outside in view of the kid's room. So he said to the kid, tonight, 8:30, when he knew it would be dark at that time of year, he said, tonight, 8:30, look right out this window, right down there by that light, okay? And you're gonna have a nice little surprise. And that night, when he rolled his bike out at 8:30, he unclicked his high-powered bike flashlight, and he shined it up at the kid's window, and he flashed it on and off, and he waved, and he turned to go. And as Steve tells the story, he said it had rained late that afternoon. So there were puddles on the pavement. And you know how puddles on pavement, when it's wet, lights, really reflect. And he said, I saw these lights flashing on and off. And I was like, it's not me. What is that? And he looked up, and the kid was flashing his room light on and off in response. He had just instinctively realized, I can respond. And Steve said it was the biggest aha moment of his whole life. Because he said he realized that if I could do this for this kid, I could do this for every kid in the hospital. And then he looked out at the city and he said, wow, there's a lot of lights there that could do the same thing. And that became his ask. He approached every business in the city. He approached every hotel. He approached every school, Brown, Providence College, every business, every bar, every coffee shop, every restaurant, every tavern. He approached the tug company on the Providence River. Same ask to everybody. 1 minute. That's all we're asking. 1 minute a night. 1 minute. Every night at 8:30, flash your lights on or off. You don't have to hire any extra people. Put it on a timer. One night. 1 minute every night. All we're asking. Now, did everybody get on board right away? Of course not. That's not how it works. But today, it's very hard to find a single business, major business, that has lights on in Providence that is not flashing them every night at 8:30. It's become the magic minute, as they say, and now the kids don't stay in their rooms. They all go up to the solarium on the top of the hospital. They all get their own flashlights to make like that first kid and respond to the city flashing their lights. The police department got involved. The fire department got involved for the magic minute. And so I'm reading about this story years ago, and so this would have been now about 5, 6 years ago, and I said, I got to do this story. So I got in touch with Steve, and I said, we'd love to come down and do a story about Goodnight Lights. And he said, we'd love to have you. And I said, one thing. I said, could you connect us with a young patient? Because I said, I'd love to see if we could experience this with a kid that's really loving this experience. And he said, let me see what I can do, and I'll call you back. And he did. He called back later that same afternoon, and he had connected us with the best patient that he possibly could have, 10-year-old Abby Waldron. Abby at that point, I'm sorry. Abby at that point was 2 years younger than my youngest daughter, and she was suffering from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Her prognosis was not yet clear. She had lost her waist-length hair, and yet the amazing thing about Abby is that, there were a lot of people around. I mean, the camera does that, right? People are like, what's going on there, right? So there was a medical staff, there were friends, her parents and friends of theirs, and a lot of people around. And yet, for the hours that we spent that afternoon in Abby's room, she was virtually the only person who never stopped smiling and laughing the whole day, the patient. And about 5 o'clock, we were like, I said, we're gonna have to take a little break, Abby. We got to figure some stuff out. And she said, well, you can't miss Goodnight Lights. And I said, miss Goodnight Lights? Young lady, what do you think we're doing here? I said, in fact, I'm fixing to sit with you to watch Goodnight Lights. Will that work? And she said, yeah. And I did. I sat right next to her. And Steve Brosnahan had created all kinds of flourishes that night. He had gotten like 3 or 4, I think you can even see, he had gotten 3 or 4 ladder companies from other communities outside of Providence. So these things are like moving in the air, and she was blown away. And that was from, you can see the CVB marker up there. This was from the show that aired about that story. And I said, what do you think tonight? And she said, oh my God, it's like the grand finale. She was blown away. And that show aired in April 2018. And then a year later in May, I think, on a Saturday night, that show won an Emmy Award. And the only reason I say that is because as soon as it was 9, 10 o'clock the next morning, and I could reasonably call somebody on Sunday morning, I called Steve, and I called Abby's family, and I said, listen, can you folks meet me in front of the hospital at 10 o'clock Monday morning, because I have something to share with you? And they said, sure. And they did, and I met them, and the people who really earned that were able to take home their Emmy. And Abby is 16 and cancer-free. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.